Hello and welcome everyone to the third annual Tom Regan Memorial Lecture. This lecture is brought to you by Culture and Animals Foundation and also University of San Diego. Today we are brought together thanks to the Culture and Animals Foundation, and the organization has come together to also honor, of course, the work of Tom Regan. The lecture today, or excuse me, the Tom Regan Memorial Lecture is given annually, and this is the third year. The Tom Regan Memorial Lecture celebrates the life and thought of Professor Regan, late Professor Regan, an animal advocate. The lecture is delivered every year that is been held by leading scholars of animal rights and is delivered at a different university each year. Of course, due to COVID, we are here online, and we're still grateful that no matter what, even with the pandemic, we are able to come together and be challenged even more so with our thoughts and the work, as I said, of Mr. Regan, but also these two exciting scholars that we have today. Before I move on, I wanted to hand it over to Professor Chris Carter to speak just for a bit, just for a couple of minutes about USD's FSI program. And he can tell you all what those mean as well, besides University of San Diego. Go ahead, Chris.
We're very grateful to have you here and excited for the conversation we're having today. And we're excited to partner, or the Food Studies Initiative is excited to partner with the Culture and Animals Foundation. Now, the Food Studies Initiative is a part of the University of San Diego, something that Dr. Gross, myself started, or I kind of had the, I should say, gestational idea several years ago, partnered with another professor in philosophy by the name of Dr. Riggle, and have been able to kind of leverage our collective desire and insights with respect to food justice and animal rights and animal advocacy to creating this initiative. At its core, we seek to engage the entire USD community on urgent questions concerning food by generating scientifically informed and justice-oriented approach to food on our specific campus that aligns with our own particular strategic plan. Now, at the foundation of the Food Studies Initiative is a commitment to interdisciplinary scholarship that empowers community members to analyze and respond to racism, and particularly anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, colonialism, climate change, balancing animals, and the ways in which all of these issues often intersect with questions of food, justice, and food sovereignty. The FSI will bring together and has brought together longstanding faculty strengths at the University of San Diego that utilize food as a vehicle for science education, for advancing more ethical supply chains, and for socially engaged scholarship in the humanities and social sciences. Ultimately, what we want to do at the FSI is to shape and reshape how our campus can be a model to other universities and how we can leverage food scholarship and food services to build community on and off campus and to establish more ethical and just foodways. So that's a little bit about us. And if you're more interested in that, I will put a link in the chat about how you can learn more about what we're doing with the Food Studies Initiative at University of San Diego.
Thank you. I also wanted to mention that not only is the Culture and Animals Foundation proud to present this lecture, but we also have a grant application online. For those of you all that are interested in applying, the applications the application process opens December 1st and closes January 31st, 2022. You can also on the website view and see past grantees. You can see more about what Culture and Animal Foundation provides. And we also not only honor the life and legacy of Professor Regan, but also October the 20th, we also experienced the passing of his wife, Nancy Regan. And I actually just found this out today as well, because I knew as was that Professor Regan and all of his work and all of his insights, I'm sure Nancy heard it all first, everywhere from the kitchen table, bedroom, everywhere. So we know that she's also a part of this foundation, but not just by association. But I found out today that Nancy is also one of the reasons why we have the arts involved with the Culture and Arts Foundation. So with that, we also want to thank, I believe she was getting online on the legacy of Tom and Nancy Regan. Their daughter will be online. So we want to honor her today as well. But as we also move forward with today, just wanted to say a quick introduction on what you all can expect today. Many of you have seen the flyer. And what we're going to do is really honor the fact that we cannot overlook the intersectionality within scholarship and research today. Today, we will be graced and blessed by two leading scholars. I would just say lead scholars. You all are lead scholars in animal rights. This year's Tom Regan lecture continues to press the discussion of veganism and animal advocacy in the context of race and gender and animality. Today, we're going to begin with Syl Ko. I'm excited, Syl, to even meet you. I have one of my favorite books. You all make sure you excited to meet you. And even though it's online, when they meet in person, I'm actually in Raleigh, North Carolina. So I'm excited to have Syl on. And just briefly, Syl Ko studied philosophy at San Francisco State. I'm also from Oakland, Syl, but San Francisco State University and University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's the co-author with Aph Ko of Aphro-ism, and that is the book that I held up, Essays on Pop Culture, Feminism, and Black Veganism from Two Sisters. She's an independent researcher known for bringing race to the forefront of the movement to end animal abuse. Her writing challenges species-centric terminology and dominant conceptions of veganism, encouraging brave and imaginative shifts in thinking that prioritize multi-species justice. Syl's lecture will be responded by Reverend Christopher Carter, Assistant Professor, Assistant Chair, Department Diversity Officer, Theology and Religious Studies at the University of San Diego, where his teaching and research focuses on philosophical and theological ethics, Black and womanist theological ethics, environmental ethics, and animal and religion. And he's the author of the forthcoming book is The Spirit of Soul Food, Race, Faith, and Food Justice. And this is through the University of Illinois Press. Go ahead and start with Syl's presentation.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. So I actually wrote this piece for last year's CAF lecture, and then it was canceled because of COVID. And then I had the great fortune of linking up with Lindgren Johnson, who is the author of Race Matters, Animal Matters, a book I highly recommend. And she and I talked a lot and bulked up the piece a little bit. So it's one of the few pieces that actually came out before I ever had a chance to even really share it or talk about it because of COVID. So you're the first audience that I'm going to be presenting it to, and it was initially written for you. The human being as the universal frame of reference is typically considered the primary source of our current planetary ills. Now, to be clear, it's not simply that human beings are the culprits behind the demise of Earth, though it is true that a large majority of us live lives or strive to live lives in which sustainability and consideration of other beings or natural landscapes are absent priorities. But rather, what is thought is that it is human beings' general positioning of themselves as central with respect to the rest of the natural world that has inevitably set the planet, or at least many of its inhabitants, including humans themselves, on a course for either oblivion or abject misery. What follows then is the assumption that the only hope in there being a reversal of this decay partially lies in decentering human beings, not merely as the grand beneficiaries of all that the natural world has to offer, but especially insofar as the human perspective is taken to be the central one. Now, these claims about centering and decentering sketch two sides that are neatly reminiscent in a limited but relevant way of the debate between the Roman Catholic Church and early secular humanists surrounding the position of the Earth with respect to the solar system. As you all know, the church decreed that the Earth sat in the center of the universe. It was static, with the sun and other celestial bodies revolving around it, while the observations and calculations of some early astronomers painted a vastly different and striking picture, namely that it was the Earth that revolved around the sun, and moreover, the Earth was one among many other stellar objects that ran the course. So in other words, Earth is not central and Earth is not unique. The consequences of decentering the Earth were twofold. First, there were exponential advancements in astronomy and astrophysics that have changed our lives and scientific thought in previously inconceivable ways. And second, a shift was implemented concerning the authority of scientific knowledge. The early secular astronomers effectively challenged the church as a credible reference for matters related to the natural world, which then called into question not just the position of the Earth in the cosmos, but also the question of the position of human beings in the natural order. However, the success achieved by the early secular humanists in decentering the Earth also invites a different and more daunting lesson that those of us hoping to decenter the human are well advised to embrace, which may at the outset appear not only disquieting, but outright contrary to our aims. This lesson involves carefully distinguishing between the act of evaluative centering and methodological centering. Evaluative centering is a judgment which is issued about the objective centrality of a particular entity or idea, and methodological centering, a starting point from which a specific project is carried out. The church's earlier decree that Earth is the literal center of the solar system and that all stellar objects, including the sun, move about it, is an example of evaluative centering. Evaluative centering typically justifies a further moral conclusion based on the judgment about the supposed centrality of a particular entity or idea. In this example, because Earth is allegedly the center of the solar system, is made of a different substance than all other celestial bodies, and is static, therefore Earth is the site of a special, unique moral narrative as described in the Bible. The astronomers promoting a heliocentric model of the solar system, however, participated in centering Earth methodologically. That is, calculations were performed and observations were made with Earth as the explicit reference point. In fact, it was owing to the astronomers' methodological centering of Earth that they were capable of evaluatively decentering Earth. That is, all of their calculations and observations were understood to be taking place from Earth. Formulas and findings were referenced from Earth to Venus, and so from Venus to the sun, and so on, as opposed to calculations from nowhere or theological observations from the allegedly literal God's eye perspective. Now, none of this is to say that natural scientific inquiries are anything like ethical inquiries. The point is simply that rarely is the question raised about what is meant when many of us insist that the human must be decentered, as if a human point of reference and the judgment that humans' needs and desires are objectively central are identical claims. They're not. If we consider the case of non-human animals specifically, the danger in confusing these two modes of centering are apparent, though of course the general point can be applied more broadly to other cases. So let's talk about non-human animals. So speciesism is the word that has come to describe and explain the lack of widespread, substantial concern for animals belonging to species other than Homo sapiens. The term suggests that the injustices faced by affected non-human animals are relevantly like the injustices that humans face due to human conflict, such as racism and sexism. According to this reasoning, what makes speciesism like racism and sexism is that in all three cases, a property which ought to be morally arbitrary, whether race, sex, or species, is included in moral deliberation to defend prejudicial thinking. Conventional animal advocates then argue that species considerations in ethical thinking, especially the idea that being human can be a reason for positive moral regard, is no different than entertaining the idea that being white or being male can be a reason for positive moral regard. I call these views that assumes species membership is irrelevant to moral deliberation species objectivist views, or species objectivism. The species objectivist casts the human being from a perspective external to the human inquirer, such that she can examine traits, capacities, or properties about human beings in much the same way she does about any other animal. Those species objectivists on the side of non-human animals believe that the conclusion is that there is no trait, capacity, or property possessed by human beings that at least one other kind of animal doesn't share. So therefore, from this objective, ideal frame of reference, which finds its content informed by the natural sciences, that being human itself can be deemed morally heavy is simply a matter of prejudice. So this means that species objectivists can only decenter humans evaluatively by decentering the human methodologically. So their strategy entails abstracting away from the fact that humans apprehend themselves from two perspectives. The first one is the one that the species objectivists note. This is this external perspective, such as when we apprehend a bat or an elephant or a dog or a cat. But what they miss is that humans also, and primarily, apprehend themselves from an internal perspective. And this is a vantage point we cannot apprehend about any other animal, and so a state about which we must remain silent with regard to other animals. Although it's true that many other animals enjoy pleasure, they suffer pain, they experience a variety of emotions, they remember, they imagine, and so forth, we as humans are unable to access the interiority of what these experiences are like from their perspective. So simply put, we are unable to subjectively experience the vantage point of any other animal. Now, views that focus on this internal perspective of being human, I call species subjectivist views, or species subjectivism. Black veganism is a species subjectivist view. So we argue that the question about our obligations to non-human animals is better reflected upon by situating it explicitly from our perspective as humans, as opposed to a supposedly neutral scientific frame of reference from nowhere. In other words, contrary to species objectivists, species subjectivists believe the best way to evaluatively decenter human beings is to center humans methodologically. And there's going to be two main motivations for this approach. So first, species subjectivism acknowledges that what attributes to human beings a moral heaviness is not some distinct property or capacity or feature or trait, but rather it is the human that is the proper object of the human moral inquiry, and whose subsequent behavior sets out the conditions under which other animals, including humans, must live. This is the same reason we do not foist our moral expectations upon, say, Bruno the family cat. It's not right to say that Bruno is intellectually or cognitively disabled to a severe degree, or on the other hand, lacks empathy and harbors antisocial tendencies, and so he cannot be reasonably asked to participate in the results of our moral deliberations, such as we might say for some humans. Instead, Bruno belongs to an entirely different form of life, which is specific to his species, subjectively closed to us, and which we cannot, and more importantly, ought not attempt to take intellectual possession of or subsume under our intellectual rubrics. This ties closely into the second motivation for a species subjectivist approach, which is that real and substantial moral regard for non-human animals necessitates appreciating that other animals themselves too have species-specific ways of subjectively existing in the world, and that they should have the space and freedom to set up and participate in their own forms of life without our interference, or at least with only minimal interference in cases where it cannot be prevented or contributes to their flourishing for mutual enrichment of the species. So whereas a species objectivist approach rests on looking for commonalities between humans and other animals as the ground for an animal ethic, species subjectivism accepts that boundaries exist between the species, and that part of respecting other animals demands resisting imposition of a human idea of what is life or even what a good life is onto them. The appreciation of there being subjective realities for all animals as the primary orientation of ethics starts with appreciating that we as humans have a specific subjective reality, which must be confessed, for we too are animals, before making claims about respecting the subjective reality and forms of life belonging to other animals. Now, what does it look like to center humans methodologically? Let's start simple. To start with, a methodological centering of the human would resist describing or explaining animal injustice as speciesism. Since we are considering the human not from the external perspective, but the internal one, we find that human injustices and injustices other animals face due to human behavior are fundamentally unlike one another. I'll read that again, okay? Since we are considering the human not from the external perspective, but the internal one, we find that human injustices and injustices other animals face due to human behavior are fundamentally unlike one another. The badness of human injustices, such as racism or sexism, arises from the exclusion of certain human populations or individuals from the very idea of human. In fact, racist and sexist ideology turn on interpreting non-whites and women, respectively, as either deviations from the ideal human or unactualized humans. A member of the species Homo sapiens, then, can be rendered a non-human, an animal, a subhuman, an interhuman, and so on by other human beings. And it is this mechanism that generates the pernicious humanisms and the subsequent negative consequences that follow. These harms are usually not only physical, but constitutionally internal of a certain type, the pain of dehumanization. Under a species objectivist model, such a mechanism cannot be explained because from an external perspective, it makes little sense to say that a human being is not a human being. From an external perspective, any member of the species Homo sapiens is a human proper. And so it fails to make sense of why being considered human matters, even in cases where only human beings are involved. If excluding human beings from the idea of human is the mechanism behind human injustices, then certainly this mechanism cannot explain or describe animal injustice, for it would be bizarre to assume that positive moral regard for animals must involve conceiving of them as human beings. And certainly acknowledging that other animals are not human does not in and of itself necessitate negative or absent moral regard for them. Recentering the human methodologically then reveals an important path to decentering humans evaluatively. Animal advocates must find a way to re-articulate or reformulate to the general public and to themselves animal injustice in its own terms, such that parallels to human injustices are not necessary as buttresses. Though well-intentioned, this obsession with modeling non-human animal injustice as if it were relevantly like human injustice obscures the degree to which animal injustice is a unique form of suffering for which we are responsible. Additionally, using human injustice as a template for understanding animal injustice logically leads to ridiculous applications of the inclusion narrative. The inclusion narrative has been essential for ensuring justice for human groups historically excluded from participating in society. And now some activists believe this can be applied to the case of non-human animals as a salve for the wrongs we commit upon them. But it is ludicrous to assume that encouraging the literal inclusion of animals into spaces designed for human flourishing is the answer to what it is to include animals in our moral thought. So what should be of note here is that species subjectivism is hinting at an incredible tension species objectivism requires for general moral thinking. Species subjectivists acknowledge that human beings operate primarily from the internal perspective in practical matters, which include moral matters carried out on a daily basis. The successful ethical relationships exemplified by friendships, marriages, humans with their animal companions, families, and so on, provide rich grounds for investigating how the local schemas and webs of lives we build and lead intrinsically supply the parameters for how we ought to interact with one another. Asking individuals to remove themselves from this perspective, the very perspective at which all other moral thinking occurs and in which all other positive moral relationships inhere, to take up the external perspective as a means to reflect on moral matters with respect to only animals seems a foolish ambition. If we wish to effect a widespread cognitive shift about non-human animals, this cannot be the way forward. In this brief space, I have tried to show that there is incredible value in making salient a kind of centering that ought to vanish versus a kind of centering that is indispensable to that disappearing act. Like the decentering of Earth in astronomy, the decentering of the human in ethics can have profound effects, both material, insofar as we can make a difference to the health of the planet and its dwellers, as well as cognitive, insofar as we can shift the scope and range of beings that qualify as morally considerable, thus recalibrating our position in the ethical order. Although humans cannot continue to believe that they are evaluatively central if the trend of our collective behaviors affecting the planet will be reversed, it is a mistake to also believe this project necessitates decentering the human frame of reference. It is true that we are trying to change the world, but to do so mostly requires changing the human. If there is any hope that a moral revolution will come to fruition in the coming years, it will have to be a revolution of the human perspective. And as such, the human perspective must remain front and center. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I want to also note that in the comments, please place any questions. I've already jotted down my own questions, but please place any questions there in the comments so that after our second presentation by Dr. Chris Carter, we will be able to, I will go ahead and return to those questions. We'll present those questions to our speaker, okay? So with that said, we'll now turn it over to Dr. Chris Carter.
All right. Well, again, I want to thank you all for being here today, because I know that you all are probably pretty tired of seeing each other in tiny squares, and that, and while I'm confident that you have been and will continue to enjoy the content of our gathering today, I want you to know how much I appreciate each of you taking the time to sit through yet another, essentially a Zoom meeting, right? Which I know we're kind of all over. I also want to thank the Culture and Animals Foundation for inviting me to respond to Syl's lecture, and especially Martin Rowe for his encouragement of my work. Now, I have had the opportunity to respond to the work of several scholars at lots of different conferences, and generally speaking, once I receive their talk, I spend a few hours reading it and marking it up. I take a lot of notes about what they said and what I liked, the points they made, and where I think they made some mistakes or didn't consider alternative perspectives. Generally speaking, like most academics, I find that I have plenty to say because we like to hear ourselves talk. However, I must confess that my encounters with Syl's work have left me with little to say or much to critique of her work. More often, I have found that they have left me with much to intellectually process so that I can ultimately include it in my own work, as she well knows. Through her writing, she has been a primary conversation partner with me, often giving me a language to articulate something or some idea that I knew to be true, but couldn't quite express, or at least I could not express it as clearly as she is able to do. So thank you, Syl, for doing such great work. And again, for those of you who are here, if you are looking for some devastating critiques of Syl's work, you will leave this talk disappointed, because that is not what I'm here to do or what I have to say. However, if you're interested in building upon the foundation for animal activism that she has laid out for us this afternoon, then I think you'll enjoy the few things I have to say for the next few minutes. Mostly you're going to enjoy what I have to say. I am going to talk about racism, and so that's probably going to make some of you uncomfortable, but I think that's the kind of uncomfortability that would probably be okay. Now, what I found especially exciting about her lecture was her argument for a non-human animal ethic, and I would argue a non-human nature ethic as well, built upon what she refers to as a species subjectivist model, a methodological recentering of the human that recognizes that from the perspective of ethical behavior, it is the human that is the proper object of the human moral inquiry, and whose subsequent behavior sets out the conditions under which other humans and non-human animals must live. As such, the kind of objectivist claim that decentering the human creates an objectivity, an objective reality, where rules, morals, or ethics can be developed independently of our internal biases, fails to take serious the role of our internal worlds, or our emotions, as Enlightenment thinkers would say, fails to take seriously the ways in which our emotions actually help shape and continue to reshape our ethics. Her argument that humans primarily apprehend themselves from an internal perspective, a vantage point that we cannot apprehend about any other animal, is in a subtle and very Syl style, overt critique of a traditional, and I would argue still dominant, view that human beings can live in a kind of purely rational Kantian moral framework. Indeed, it is the belief and outright worship of this kind of Kantian and other Enlightenment thinkers' arguments for pure reason as the ideal and objective way of being human that sits at the foundation, I would argue, of the species objectivist view that she rightly critiques. It is no coincidence, then, that she uses a geocentric versus heliocentric controversy between the Roman Catholic Church and scientists as an analogy to help us understand the weaknesses of a species objectivist human decentering. Copernicus, Galileo, and Kant all represent a kind of shifting away from a kind of species subjectivist that's centered on religious belief and practice. To be sure, the species subjectivist attitudes of medieval Europe were not ideal either. However, they did present moral frameworks, or the moral frameworks of the day did place human beings in relationship with non-human nature rather than objectively outside of non-human nature, with the possibility of controlling nature. And this movement of humans from inside to outside of nature is where we find ourselves today. And where still much of animal advocacy, I would argue, finds itself today. Now, what I think is interesting and worthy of discussion for us today is kind of the why and what were the consequences of the Enlightenment shift toward this kind of species objectivist thinking. How might we respond to it today, and how it still kind of influences the work that we are about with respect to animal rights and human rights and social justice. So I just have a couple of things that I wrote down I want to say really quickly. Now, Syl notes, a failure of species objectivist thinking is a failure to acknowledge that our internal world shape how we do ethics. Now, what I would like to do is push her claim a little bit further and say that for species objectivists, that this failure to acknowledge their internal worlds is rooted in a belief that their internal world is neutral, objective, and in this sense, godlike. If the internal or subjective can be rendered neutral, then it has achieved a state of perfection that is eerily reminiscent of traditional Christian understandings of God and divine perfection. This neutrality I would argue this belief that one can be neutral, that one can distance oneself to make kind of these moral claims, is rooted and manifested in a sense in this idea of whiteness, particularly within the European framework. Whiteness as neutral, whiteness as the arbiter of what counts as human and whose humanity counts, or whiteness as, or as I should say, Eurocentric culture and the ways in which it dictates what counts as nature and how nature ought and ought not be valued. A contemporary illustration that I think is very relevant for what's happening in our world right now is in the Ahmaud Arbery case with respect to whiteness and this idea of neutrality, the whiteness and this idea of objectivity. Now, if you were to follow, if you've been following the case, what you may have noted is that the judge in this case, and they were talking about the jury has one person of color, one Black person, and the rest of everybody else is white. Now, over the course of the jury selection, prosecutors in Georgia objected to defense attorneys as they repeatedly removed to strike potential Black jurors from the trial. They were calling it unconstitutional. And while the judge, I think Timothy Walmsley, while he basically acknowledged that intentional discrimination was kind of at the heart of what was happening, he told the court that he was unable to reinstate any jurors who had been dismissed because he said that the defense made race neutral arguments for tossing them. He said, quote, "They have been able to explain to the court why, besides race, those individuals were struck from the panel." Again, what this does, it goes to reaffirm this idea that whiteness can in fact be neutral, that anything that is non-white is non-neutral and therefore has a kind of subjectivity that cannot be trusted to render any kind of moral law. And so this tension, I think, of what it means to recenter the human has to also wrestle, it cannot in our current construct, not wrestle with issues of race that I think sit at the forefront of how we understand what it means to be human. Which brings me to my second point. Recentering the human, and I know, so you actually essentially talk about this. I feel like if you had wrote another, 6 or 7 pages, I'm sure this is, at least I think this is where you're going, but again, I could be wrong. It requires a redefinition of what it means to be human, or as Sylvia Winter refers to it as, what it means to practice being human, the praxis of being human. Now, this looks different for different folks, right? So in my own work, I talk about what it means to redefine what it means to be human from a Christian theological perspective, what we call theological anthropology, redefining the relationship between the human and God, humans and humans and non-human nature in ways that center norms and values that deny exploitation, that also build upon the moral principles of self-love, solidarity, and interconnectedness. This is, I think, fairly straightforward within this tradition. However, many people in this field, many people in this space that are in animal advocacy are not religious. They are secular. And this is so my question for you, and where I'd be curious to your thoughts. This kind of brings me to Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, and this kind of notion of how do we make these arguments, right, centering on human morality that's kind of built upon these objectivist Kantian claims. And again, I'm sure you know, he makes this argument that that we can't, ultimately, that we have to move back to what he would call an Aristotelian framework, but I think also could be inclusive of indigenous African spiritualities, and as Peter Paris writes, and indigenous American spiritualities, as Robin Kimmerer writes, right? And so the question I think we have, or the question I'm curious about, is this appropriate recentering of the human. What does it look like from a moral perspective? What's the foundation for it? Can it still happen within this framework of a kind of Kantian ethics, or does it require moving back to a kind of virtue-centered approach, right? Where you have vices at extremes, but something where everybody has a kind of telos, a goal, right, of what it means to practice being a certain kind of person that's striving towards a kind of excellence in character, virtue, and behavior. This to me seems like the appropriate direction to go. But again, I am curious as to what you would say. So thank you all for being here. If you are having, I don't know if people are having issues typing in the chat. If that is the case, then I will definitely make sure I make some tweaks to that, because we're trying to make sure we kind of kept control of that. But that is all I have to say. So thank you again for being here today and for listening to my few ramblings on Syl's amazing work.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you so much. We have a few questions in the comments that were sent directly to me. One of them, because I wanted to be able to, I'm going to pose a question for you, Syl, and Chris to respond to, and you guys can respond to each other. One of them I wanted to mention, as Christopher was speaking about religion and that coming to hand. This question is from Cassidy Bates, and she asked, do you think religion can be used to help decenter humans and think of others, and she puts in parentheses, others as animals, people of color, and women as equals? And I'm assuming when she's saying decenter humans and centering others, maybe you all can define who she sees as a majority in that is who's being defined as humans. But again, do you think religion can be used to help decenter humans and think of others as equals? Syl, would you like to start?
Yeah, oh, sorry, Chris, did you want to say something?
Well, as religious, so I was like, well, I'm the religious person on here. So
I was gonna say like one line and then give it to Chris because this is your field. But yeah, I don't believe that religion is intrinsically hostile to what a decentering the way that I needs to happen kind of project would look like. Religion actually is a perfect example of something that is the result of human life. That's not to say that non-human animals don't have their own things going on, but like I said in the talk, and I like to constantly repeat this, they're subjectively close to us in a really important way, and this saves us a lot of trouble and time of trying to be like, well, you don't know if animals are. I said, well, we can't say, right, because you have to be one of them, not a human converted into one of them using grand technology, but you have to be one of them to even know whether or not they're having their own little religious discussions, or maybe they would all laugh at us that we have to do something like religion, right? But religion is a perfect example of a very specific human kind of form of behavior, right? Like every human group has their own kind of spiritual belief and is really important to us. And how we choose to use it really depends on the people. So I don't, I'm not anti-religion. I don't think religion is necessarily antithetical to a project with animals. And I think religion can be useful in many ways. And in fact, Chris, you and I have talked about this before, especially in a world that has kind of critiqued religion, or at least in the West, critiqued religion to the point where being religious or talking about religion is seen as backwards or like a hillbilly or or something, or regressive. We've discussed how religion is one of the few places where we even have the kind of language that's necessary for ethical or like moral life. Because if we spent so much time talking about these kind of ethical matters in the realm of religion. And then when it became fashionable to start critiquing religion or push away from religion, we also moved away from the very language, the very vocabulary that we developed in order to discuss matters that were essentially the most important matters in human life, right? Which would include animals and natural landscapes and so on. And so because we never found a way to replace it, some people are trying to replace it with psychology, which I think is a problem because then we pathologize things. But I mean, because we haven't really replaced that vocabulary, or we don't have any jargon to talk about these kind of deeper matters, religion is one nice way to, kind of deal with that. But Chris, I'm sure you have a more sophisticated thoughts on this.
Not necessarily. No, I think that's an excellent response. I think, in a sense, I want to be clear too that we're talking about decentering the human. And I appreciate actually still the way you approached it. It's recentering the human, like appropriately, like right sizing. I don't know the term people want to use, but it's centering in a particular kind of way. And so it's not as much as that I think we should decenter the human as much as I think we should center the human appropriately. And we should also recognize that the way in which you go about being human, practicing being human, defining what it means to be human, that needs to shift, that needs to evolve, and that needs to change. I think with respect to secular, I think religion is, as you said, isn't antithetical, isn't hostile, and actually can be helpful in this regard. But also recognize that from a broader societal perspective, religion has limitations because of its ability to, well, theoretically, its ability to shape public policies and political discourse.
Mhm.
Obviously, there's a huge caveat in this with what's happening right now. And this is where I get back to the work of people like Alistair McIntyre in his book After Virtue that came out in the 80s, that I think is really helpful in this regard. This idea of how do we recapture a language? Because what happened, as still as you noted, when we moved away from this, we got to this critique of religion, we lost the language of we lost a kind of moral language and moved to the language of rights. And when you get to the language of just dealing with rights, it's all centered on, it's much more centered on power rather than practice. In the language of virtue, and again, this is not limited to Aristotle, but he's probably the one that most of us know. As I mentioned, Peter Paris in his book, The Spirituality of African Peoples, and Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, I think, give it a framework for other kinds of spiritualities rooted in a kind of virtuous practice that's much more about avoiding vicious extremes and about having this kind of goal, this telos, this ideal way of being human. This is, I would argue, religious as such. Now, Aaron actually can probably say more about this than I can because he's the religious studies person. But this is, I think, what is helpful about this about religion, but also about a kind of philosophy that's oriented towards being, right? That's more oriented towards ontology. That's again focused on a kind of way of being in the world that takes seriously the harms we can cause to natural world or non-human animals. So that's all I add to that. But that was actually that was a better answer than I was surprised, given you know, given our conversations about religion in the past. But that's between you and I.
Okay, really quickly though, Chris, you were speaking about content framework and going back to the text you were talking about from the 80s on virtue ethics. Syl, could you respond to Chris's, and excuse me, you all, if I'm referring to you by your first name, if that's okay. Syl and Chris, Syl, if you can refer to, or you can respond to Chris's suggestion or yeah, leading to like whether you could possibly move from a content framework to a virtue ethic. Is that something possible? And make sure I'm getting that right, Chris, as what you were mentioning.
Yeah. So did that question make sense? How I ended it? Did that question make sense?
No. What's the question?
Okay, so the question I was asking really is this kind of what you're describing, this kind of subjectivist way of thinking with respect to non-human nature, non-human animals. I agree with. I think it's makes a ton of sense. What I think it requires, though, is a way of thinking about morality outside of the kind of rights framework, outside of the kind of, again, that's why I go back to Kant or those other kinds of framework, because those rights necessarily require kind of an objective framework of standing outside to say who gets them and who doesn't. This kind of idea or design of the rights, I think, come from this allegedly objective place. And so I'm curious, what kind of philosophical or moral grounds or framework do you think we need to move towards a kind of subjectivist framework, this kind of recenter the human appropriately, to make that be persuasive to people who aren't religious?
Right. Well, first of all, I don't think it demands moving from one framework to another. So, so I didn't mention this in the talk, but species objectivism and species subjectivism are not specific kinds of ethical theories. So, for instance, for species objectivism, there can be a number of different ethical theories that are clustered under that label. And you can even have, views that are not on the side of non-human animals under a species objectivist view as well, by the way. So for instance, you have people who make the argument, well, only, our human beings are the only ones who have this capacity or property, and therefore this gives them this extra moral value. That's a kind of species objectivist view. They're saying, if you line up all of the species, right, if there's some way we could do that, I can point and show you how the human has these certain kind of capacities that no other animal has, and therefore they have more value. So species objectivism can be on the side of non-human animals or not on the side of non-human animals, and it can involve many different theories. So for instance, I would consider Peter Singer and Tom Regan both species objectivists, although both of them are coming from completely different ethical theories, right?
Yeah.
And the same can be said for species subjectivism. It's not a particular ethical view. There can be lots of different ethical views clustered under it, and it can also be used on the side of animals or against animals. So it's not so much about the ethical view. And I also happen to, to believe that sometimes we maybe confer too much importance to theory. And in reality, most people, regardless of what they're saying, are not acting very theoretically when it comes to practical matters, which involves moral matters. And this is what I think is fascinating about the animal advocacy movement. When it comes to talking about humans and when it comes to human injustice, everybody actually talks about it in a way that makes a lot of sense. But then they start talking about animals, and then we start, talking about capacities and properties and all these kinds of things, and we think that this is supposed to mean something, which is very bizarre. We don't do this with humans, which is why I mentioned at the end of the talk, listen, we already have successful ethical interactions between humans and humans and humans and animals, actually. If you look at what's going on there, is it anything like what the species objectivists are talking about? Is it, so, imagine if, and I always use this example in my talk, when I'm treating Bruno, who's my cat, when I'm treating my Bruno like he's, a king, and he has everything a cat could possibly want, is it because there's something objective that I'm apprehending about Bruno that no other cat has, and it's to that I'm responding? Like, no, I call Bruno my cat, and by calling him my cat, I'm now conferring onto him a certain status. Something similar happens in our relationships with humans as well, right? If my boyfriend comes home and says, listen, Syl, I took you class in utilitarianism, and I figured out there's nothing special about you. You're exactly like any other person down the street, so I don't have to treat you differently. I'd be mad, first of all, but secondly, I would think, oh, someone's manipulating your mind. Like, no one's in a relationship with each other because they think there's something from this objective cosmic level, that there's something about you that you're picking up on and responding to, and that's why you're treating them in this kind of preferential manner, right? It's by choosing that person to be your boyfriend or your girlfriend that you confer upon them this special moral status, which is specific to them and has nothing to do with how you're going to relate to other human beings, right? And so in my talk, I'm sort of making this point that we already act in ways that are going to lead us to successful ethical interactions. But for some reason, when it comes to non-human animals, we suddenly start getting really theoretical and making all of these random pronouncements about what we need to do, which doesn't really jive with what we know to be the case when it comes to human-human interactions. And so I'm asking this question, why is it that you want to remove people from the very perspective in which all other relationships, especially successful relationships in here, why are you asking to remove them from that perspective to think about animals? Why do you think that's going to work? That's what I'm asking. It's not so much about the ethical theory that you're adhering to. It's more about, realistically speaking, it's from the subjective perspective that we have ethical relationships, or that we can think of ethics, regardless of what you want to say about the theory. Why should we remove ourselves from this perspective to think about one of what I would consider one of the greatest problems right now, which is, non-human animal suffering? And of course, I'm also talking about plant life and like landscapes and so on. So it's actually quite a simple kind of question that I'm asking.
I think, Candace, there's one thing I want to say in response to that, and I think this goes back to I would argue the answer, if I could say, or not even one answer, I should say the answer, an answer to that question as you were speaking, all that kept coming up for me is this inability, this way in which in our contemporary understanding of what it means to get to be human, we are asking ourselves to separate our reason and emotion. Like, that's all. It's this inability to, when we talk about relationships in that way, there's this tacit acknowledgement that what we call love is in and of itself messy. We don't know why we love. Like, we don't know, right? Like, you just do, you know, like, you know, it's evolutionarily, we know why we need to be in relationship with each other, but we don't really know, right, even from a scientific perspective, how this works in our bodies in that particular kind of way. And because, again, this is where I do think not so much theory is why we people get into the theoretical part, but why I think it's helpful at least to wrestle with some of those kinds of theories, and I know you agree with that as well, is that until we get to a place where we understand that this dualistic framework of separating our reason and emotions, where we actually believe what neuroscientists are telling us in terms of how our bodies and brains work together, right? That only until we get to that point do I think we move to this place you are describing, where we can take relationships as such seriously with non-human nature and non-human animals. Because in our heads, as we've been taught to think, or we believed ourselves to be thinking rationally, we believe that is irrational. Like, you know what I'm saying? We believe that is irrational. And until we begin to move away from this notion of the triune brain and how our things work, I think this is where we're going to struggle. I think we're going to continue to struggle with that. And I do think that is rooted in a kind of Eurocentric, you know, framework of what it means to be, like how our brains function and how emotions are supposed to be. So I guess that's kind of where, for me, I get to theory. But you're right, in terms of the practical isn't necessarily tied to theoretical often with people. But it's helpful in as much to understand, well, how do we get to this place where people begin to think this way, right? And then what do we do in light of that? So anyway, that's enough of me rambling on about theory that probably no one's interested in besides Syl and maybe one other person on this in this group.
Okay, well, we have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm really excited. We're going to turn to Professor Gary Comstock, professor of philosophy at NCSU, that's North Carolina State, NC State here. Syl and Chris, would you like to comment to this? He writes, pushing back against virtue and McIntyre, and for rights and Regan talk. Every liberation movement that has made progress in a culture arrayed against the others has done so in the name of rights. Virtuous people are great, but judges making decisions that bind others on threat of punishment are better equipped to move society in the right direction.
I would say I agree with a part of what he's saying. I think that with respect to a justice-oriented system, you know, our criminal justice system, it's not that rights don't have a place. But even saying that, right, that requires this belief that, I mean, history has shown us, current history shows us the way in which rights can be manipulated when we talk about them that don't result in you know, good outcomes, right? And so if we think about, this is where the distinction, I think, between intention and impact is important. This judge in Georgia, they're saying their intention about trying to create this neutral jury that's actually going to render justice. But the impact of them saying, well, we ask these race neutral questions, quote unquote, the idea that something can be race neutral in and of itself is absurd. As a mechanism to remove these Black jurors, we know that the impact of this action is racist, right? And so it's about developing, so then yes, we can develop policies or procedures and structures to prevent that. But that isn't, but that has, I would argue that until we reshape the people that are within those systems to operate from a kind of virtuous framework, the systems we're going to recreate are going to continue to be white supremacists. Are still going to operate in ways that harm non-human nature and harm non-human animals, because they come from a perspective of white male human supremacy. And so I don't think that they're necessarily mutually exclusive is probably the best way for me to say it. I think there's a way to talk about human beings as practicing virtue, and a way to do this with respect to rights. And I don't know offhand, I don't feel confident that his argument that that social justice movements have been dependent upon rights. I don't, maybe in the West, I want to say maybe, but I don't but that even that makes me feel like I'm not taking seriously the ways in which justice movements that took place in decolonizing Africa, particularly ways in which that was done in some places in more peaceful ways, or the ways in which rights or progress has been given in other countries outside of a Eurocentric framework. I think too often, and even in this conversation, I wrestle with the fact that we're talking so much about Europe, when there's so many other ways to think about what it means to be human and to do this kind of work, that I think is important for us to acknowledge as well. That I know I try to even acknowledge in my own work. Hopefully
Okay.
that was a decent answer. I apologize
Yeah,
if it
I
wasn't the
think
answer you're looking for.
you don't have to necessarily like dismiss both, but we can have a both and a ethics, but then the fact that rights can be something that we can also push as well. I think that's what you were saying, kind of a both and. Dr. Comstock's comment. Can you hear me still?
Oh, I hear you now. What's going on?
Okay. No, I was asking if you had a response to Dr. Comstock's question or comment. Did you want me to restate it?
No, I never said I was against rights. I mean, I don't think it's the only way to go. But hey, I was once at an appeals case non-human rights project. I was there. Okay, tears in my eyes when I heard Steve Wise making his arguments. Okay, I agree with Chris. We want good laws, but we want good people too.
Yeah. Definitely. I want to kind of move and then make sure this is a really good question from, well, these are all awesome questions, but from Mark Real. He says religious texts are overwhelmingly male written and centered. Rules and power are patriarchal in these scriptures. Non-human animals are subordinated to the human in their narratives as well. And this is more of a comment, but how do you all respond to that?
I'll just say that I think this requires exposing yourself to, or this requires, yes, he's right. These things are written by men and they're written in a way that they can center male experience. That is not the only way to read it. Because in as much as if you look at the work that womanist scholars have done, Black women scholars especially, Black women theologians, have done tremendous work in excavating, particularly I would say within the Christian tradition, texts to give voice to their own experiences and to give voice to those who don't have a voice in those texts. And so this is about hermeneutics. It's about what lens do we take to a particular text and how do we read it, right? So we can read the quote unquote Christian Bible and see Jesus as this person who looks like the Hollywood version of Jesus, right? White dude, straight white hair, clean cut or whatever. Or we can see him as a first century, Palestinian Jew who was a citizen or not a citizen under Roman occupied Palestine, who didn't have rights, who was literally fighting for decolonization of his space. And so that changes the framework of how you're going to read that text, if you understand that that's kind of a more appropriate hermeneutic. And so I think while there's truth in many of those claims, I also want to suggest that there's also there are other ways to engage those texts, right, in a more subversive way that can breathe life to many justice-oriented movements.
Bill, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I'm not. So, I mean, Chris is the theological scholar here. I'm not super. I don't know much about religion, but I mean, but I can say that in philosophy, there's a similar kind of thing that goes on. Okay, so for instance, a lot of people don't want to read Kant anymore, or they don't want to talk about, Nietzsche or whatever, right? Because a lot of these people kind of held problematic views. A lot of these views did people used in bad ways or whatever. But that's not to say that there isn't any value in their work. And again, depends on what you're reading it for. When I'm reading Kant, I'm not particularly interested in his, views about his slave, right? He said some weird stuff about his African slave or whatever. But if I'm reading Kant because I'm interested in the, the B deduction, the critique of pure reason, his views about his slave are just not really relevant in that respect. And so I get some pushback from people because I really love early modern philosophy. I like a lot of ancient Greek philosophy. I love Nietzsche. I love a lot of people that are considered racist or sexist or whatever. And I think that there has to be some nuance in how you read these people.
Mhm.
I'll put it that way. But yeah, I can't
Yeah.
say anything with the religion thing because I don't know too much about it.
Okay. Quickly, Natalie from Animal Think Tank asks, in trying to recenter fellow animals and decenter humans, and I believe, of course, we kind of talked about, you're saying like recentering in a I would say a more robust, like I guess a accepting to everyone, but she says in trying to recenter fellow animals and decenter humans, do you think that the term presents a barrier to that? And she says, I'm curious to hear how you all think dismantle that through the language we use. Kind of reminds me of Lisa Kimmerer's use of animal, Anymal. So do you think that us changing the language helpful or not, or some ways, some language like using non-human is a barrier to that?
Candace, you're kind of cutting in and out. I think it may be helpful for you if you could even just you can copy and paste the question and put it in the chat. That may even help for us to be able to see. Because yeah, I couldn't understand your question. Hmm. That's interesting. So I have a couple of thoughts, but I'm more interested in you have to say. From a in the classroom, when I use the term non-human animal, it opens the door for my students to think about themselves in the way in which they place themselves in the broader ecological system. In that sense, I would say it's very helpful. Um, I don't know, but that's also to say that I think there are limitations in terms of the language that we have and what we're trying to accomplish with it. And as long as we recognize those limitations, I think we can use terms and we can deploy terms in spaces that we think they may be more or less useful and not be kind of married to a particular kind of term that we have to use, right? If the goal is to invite people to be their best selves, we have to find a language that speaks to them, right? So I would say this, like, in the I work at a predominantly white institution. And so the words and the way I speak in a classroom is different than the ways in which when I worked in Compton and I worked at a Black church, right? That's just a different kind of language, different kind of vocabulary. I could be saying the same thing, but saying it in a very, very different way. And so I think trying to think how we might deploy language more strategically is probably the best way I would say how I would answer that question. But still, I'm curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, I just think it depends on context, right? I mean, so for instance, if I'm trying to emphasize that humans are animals, and now I'm going to be talking about animals that aren't human, if anyone has ever read Aphro-ism, you know that I only talk about 3 different ways you can use the word human, 3 different ways you can use the word animal, and it can turn into a mess. I mean, when I was working on my dissertation before I left school, I was sitting there saying human subscript 1, human subscript 2, human subscript 3, human subscript A, because the way that we use these words depends on language. So for instance, in one context you can say Chris is an animal, and if we're talking about biology, like, yeah, okay. Now we're in another context, and now let's say it's some hardcore racist is like Chris is an animal, right? That very same sentence in a different context coming from a different person's mouth now means something different. So it depends on what you mean. If you're in a biological context and you're trying to emphasize something about human beings, but you want to call them human animals to be like super super accurate, but you also want to now talk about other kinds of animals, it would be really helpful there to say non-human animals, right? Or else everyone's going to start getting confused. So I think that people can get sensitive about language, but they forget that there's a particular kind of context that we're talking about, lots of different ways that we use the same words. So I think it just depends.
Okay, I'm going to copy paste another question, but also I want to also share in the comments, Dr. Gross has posted some important work from Comstock as well. So Syl, I sent you a question earlier. I don't know if you were able to look at it. But this question is from, I don't want to scroll up too far without taking, but the question says, with Syl, like your discussion between decentering the human as a subjective, it says to a political enterprise and decentering the human as an objective commitment. Did they understand you said?
Wait, so you're talking about, I liked your distinction between decentering the human
Yes.
as a subjective enterprise and decentering the human as an objective commitment. If I understood you, you think we should pursue the subjective enterprise, but not the objective commitment. Would you care to speculate about what the chances of success are for either of these admiral goals? No, I'm saying we see things from two different perspectives, which are both important and both have a lot of interplay. My point is that species objectivists are eliminating the second perspective, which is the perspective in which most of our ethical relationships adhere.
Okay.
That's all I'm saying.
Okay. Okay. Well, this is a question from Danielle Kane. I'm going to post it so in the comments so you can see. And excuse me, your comment about ethical foundations is intriguing still, but isn't it risky to have no parts apart from your relationship? It says, to use your example, she should have rights that's independent of her value to her boyfriend.
Whoa, hold on. I'm not understanding why rights is coming up over and over again. One of the biggest species objectivists is Peter Singer. Peter Singer is not arguing for rights. So I'm not sure where the right stuff is coming from. So take the right stuff out of the conversation. I'm not making any claims about rights. Neither are some species objectivists, right? So what I'm trying to do is emphasize what I believe to be a mistake in animal advocacy, which is trying to align categories like race or sex or ability, trying to align those kind of categories with a category like species membership. This, I think, has been a major mistake. Now, this is something that's been encouraged by someone like Peter Singer, right? And he's extremely influential. And he even argues, listen, in the same way that we have this bias towards race and a bias towards sex, or species is just the larger one. So he does this kind of concentric circle model. I don't know if anyone's like a big Singer fan. I am, so I know everything he's written. So, you know, and he's just arguing that, as you go wider and wider, species is going to be the widest kind of prejudicial kind of circle. That's what he's arguing. So for Peter Singer, he's going to say species membership is a category like race and like sex. And for that reason, that's how he gets his argument off the ground. I'm coming around and I'm saying, I don't know if that's a good way to think about a category like species membership. I think species membership can be used in that way and has many times, but I think species membership can also be used like another kind of group membership like family. Most people understand that family membership is a kind of relationship in which when you speak of someone or think of someone as a family member, regardless of whether or not you're biologically related to them, that you are now conferring onto them a kind of special moral status, which again has nothing to do with how you're going to treat other people, right? So for instance, if I'm at the hospital with my father who's dying from cancer, and then right down the hall, there's another person dying from cancer, even if they both are suffering, let's say some ethical or suffering mathematician came in and he said, look, they both are suffering 100, level 100. It would be bizarre to ask me to now split my time between my father and this random guy, because it's my father, right? Him being my father means that his interest, his pain, his pleasure is going to matter to me more than the other person. And it doesn't mean that I'm going to be mean to the other person or I can do bad things to the other person. I have to respect him for different reasons, right? But my father being my father can be a reason why I'm going to treat him differently than any other guy in the world. And what's interesting is we have a family membership term for animals as well. I brought it up earlier, pets, right? By calling an animal your pet, you're conferring onto them a family-like status, which then means that you are going to be able to justify spending a lot of money on their, their surgeries and their insurance and cat towers and cat toys and all the stuff. Now, this doesn't mean that you can go kill, other cats or beat them up or do horrible things to them. It just means that you're going to have a different reason for why you're going to be respectful to the stray cat than you are to Bruno, your family cat. So my argument is that I think that there's a mistake in putting these kinds of categories together because it misses ways in which species membership is really important in understanding human injustices. So for people who claim that they are trying to understand racism or sexism or human injustices, if you remove the value that we generally presuppose comes with being human, you've now taken away the explanation for why racism is bad, for instance, or why sexism is bad, or why other human injustices are bad. You can't have it both ways. You can't say, oh, no, humans is morally arbitrary. It's an empty kind of category like race or sex, and you're just being a prejudiced bigot when you are now trying to load it morally. You can't say that and then on the other hand say racism is bad, because that's what racism is. Racism is taking a group of individuals who are human and removing them from the idea of being human. And that's why it's no coincidence that we go straight to human animal terms when there's racist injustice or when people are trying to fight for their rights in racism. We go straight to, I'm not treated like a human, I feel subhuman, or you're an animal, you're this. It's not a coincidence that we go to these kinds of terms. It's because they're deeply related to how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to others. So this is a crucial aspect to understanding human injustice, which is why, as a person who's interested in how do we talk about human and animal injustice in the same space, I'm worried that if you take away the thing that makes human injustice bad as a way to try to make sense of the animal situation, now you've created an even larger gap between people who care about human injustice and people who care about animal injustice. And so what my whole project is, and my project has been since Aphro-ism, is what are ways that we can talk about these injustices together that doesn't try to reduce one to the other, and that doesn't rely on this idea that we have to find some sort of deep similarity between them in order to motivate people to care about them. What if the way to get people to care about animal injustice is not by pretending it's like human injustice? What if we just acknowledge it's a very different kind of phenomena that's going on, and it's no less important because of it? Like, why isn't it okay to just acknowledge like there's something different going on with animal injustice? When we are harming animals, there's something different going on than when we're harming each other. Sylvia Wynter's work goes into this. She doesn't talk about animals, but she talks about humans, right? When she talks about human and animal, like human animal binary thinking, she's saying the human, capital H, is a group of humans, but the anti-human or the animal, capital A, are also humans. She's talking about it like this, right? That when you want to talk about the human other, you're talking about other humans. And what the hell does that mean, right? So obviously, when you're talking about human injustice, these are important terms, and you have to believe that being human matters, or else why would racism matter then? So who cares if someone's excluded from the idea of humanity if humanity doesn't mean anything?
So can I ask a question, Syl, in response, I guess, with you're saying that we should not, you're suggesting that do not place these all on the same level: racism, speciesism, sexism, and that should be a focus. Also, a focus at the same time. I don't want to do the either or. Also, be focusing on the system in place that is the umbrella to all these oppressions. Is that also something that is looking at the system in place that has us differentiating, or even for many people to feel to put speciesism alongside racism? And the fact is that we're in a system itself. Many people call it just racism or white male patriarchy that's in place as a response to these oppressions overall. Is it something that we can do at the same time, or when does one look at the larger system in place? Does that make sense? I'm trying to read.
Yeah, but you don't have to literally talk about one injustice at a time in order to talk about injustice.
Yes.
Right? I don't know if I'm misunderstanding you.
Yeah, we don't have to talk about one at a time, but I was just really in hearing because I do remember that as part of your book, and asking or putting out there that, look, we're not going to see them the same, because for many people, as we know, I know from being amongst people of color, if we're talking about, or if they hear that I'm presenting a paper or talking about animal rights or being pushing or discussing veganism, they're like, well, yeah, don't ask me any questions about um, plastic straws or animals when we have issues like I can't breathe. So then, you have people that are like having those, difficulties, especially within communities that are experiencing, oppressions. So how do they, is that what you're pushing at? Because you really want to make sure that people know that, look, we're not seeing them equally, because there's some people that feel like, okay, that's why I'm not supporting animal rights. That's why I'm not saying, I don't want to use rights, but um, just for animals, because it's for so long I'm seeing that you're trying to place it at the same from what I'm experiencing, no color or
No,
woman.
no, I'm not saying anything about, what level they're on. I think that they're different. I think that a species membership is a different kind of category.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. Chris, were you going to say something?
Yeah, no, I think that the point Syl has made and continues to make is, I think you might have to say it 5 or 6 more times for people to fundamentally get what you're talking about in terms, which
Right, right.
I sense it. I mean, I sense it. It's frustrating because I do think that there's a way in which people have, it has been normalized to believe that in order to talk about a kind of injustice, we have to kind of be able to somehow relate it to ourselves or whatever. And what you're saying is that's not helpful, actually. Um,
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I'm not frustrated because that's how you're supposed to think. If you've been
yeah,
into animal advocacy for a long
exactly.
time, that's how you're supposed to think, right? I mean, the word speak. That's why Aph and I are critical of the term speciesism, because that very word is already doing a lot of work there, and there's a good intention behind it. So there's several reasons why people want to put these categories in the same space. So one is, well, it's a way to make species membership morally arbitrary, right? If you want to say being human shouldn't matter, well, compare it to categories in which they're morally arbitrary. So if you say, listen, if race is morally arbitrary and sex is morally arbitrary, and well, species is morally arbitrary. And you know how I know? Because look, species doesn't affect how someone suffers or whatever. So say you're utilitarian, and that's the move you're going to make. So that's a Peter Singer move. I mean, he deliberately says, I chose speciesism as the word for, to describe and explain animal injustice, because everyone already understands that racism and sexism are bad precisely because race and sex are morally, or should be morally, neutral terms, right? And another reason that people use it, again, kind of the point that you're making, is that, well, if you already believe that certain injustices are bad and you can link another injustice to it that people don't normally think is bad, this is a way to kind of encourage them to say, oh, look, that's kind of connected. If this is bad and you acknowledge is bad, and you can also see how this is connected to that, and therefore you have to think this is bad. I mean,
So for me,
I get
so
it.
Yeah.
what I think is interesting, and what I want to say before I know we finish up, is there's a way in which, and I don't think you're doing this intentionally, but whenever I hear the term, or when in your writing, you wrote like, oh, people did it with good intentions, my racism flag just goes right up, because that's essentially what racism. It's just a bunch of good intentions, and I can see how someone like Singer creates something without thinking about the ramifications of the consequence of how this pertains or can impact the way in which racialized bodies are at stake in this kind of conversation, and how that gets and those bodies aren't taken seriously. And as much as we can talk about, well, even sexism, right? We can say racism, sexism are bad. We can say that, but I don't actually fundamentally believe, and I would argue many people like to think they believe that. And this gets back to my arguments about neuroscience, right? They think they believe it, but in reality, what we see is that many people don't. Like, they actually don't. This is the distinction between theory. We think it's bad in theory, but in practice, right? In practice, it's pretty obvious that white people definitely don't think it's bad, right? Like, broadly speaking, like they may think, oh, it's not good, but it's not bad, and so this is why we are where we are today. And this is why I think, again, your book is really helpful, because it illuminates that, we don't have to compare to say both are evil, both are wrong. They're wrong on their own terms. And comparison, in some sense, I would argue from the perspective of race, and I think you would probably argue, well, maybe I don't know what you would say with respect to gender, it can weaken, and it has weakened the argument for Black people to talk about issues of racial injustice. And this is where I get into the way in which racism is so rampant in the animal rights space, right? Because I think it has continued to be weak, and it's continued to expose the weakness of race and race thinking within that space.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I think it also undermines the extent to which animals are suffering. I mean, again, this is like the example of my father in the hospital dying from cancer and my neighbor dying in the hospital from cancer, right? I mean, there's a certain kind of attachment I have to my father, and that I'm going to feel his suffering more deeply. And it would be ridiculous to ask me or tell me there's something wrong with me because I'm not feeling the same kind of feeling for my father that I feel for my neighbor, right? And the only reason that I would the only reason anyone would encourage that is because they're trying to push you to see them as being similar instead of, well, these are just two different things that are happening. Your father, you have this specific relationship to this person, is dying, and they play a significant role in your life. And so there's a certain kind of trauma happening there, a certain kind of suffering happening there. And then this person that you know who plays a different role in your life, and it's a different kind of thing that's happening. And it's okay to see those two things as different things. And then you can appreciate the trauma of what the other person is going to, as opposed to, well, if I have to feel the same way about both, obviously I'm going to feel stronger about my father. And so I think that that's actually what's happening when we start trying to, we do this kind of obsessive work of, let's put them all in the same space in this kind of superficial way, like they're like each other. Like, oh, come on, people are not going to feel the same way about what they see as pork, in a factory farm as they do about, people dying in a genocide or something, nor should they. I mean, that's the point here, right? So which is why I'm worried about, not only is it not effective, it's just the wrong kind of approach, it's the wrong kind of explanation for what's going on.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. It seems like you're don't want to pull away from the strength of, of our task and what we have to do in speaking these truths, because when you just, like you said, like merging them together, it can weaken things, and then people not seeing like the goal at stake, and they're just, as you said, using terms to kind of make it more popular or kind of pull people in to maybe finding some sort of interest, as you said, within speciesism when it's used in that sense, alongside racism and sexism. So those things are important. We want to really thank you, Syl and Chris. Again, thank you, Syl, for your extremely, your hard work and the ideas of which you're bringing to this conversation. And I really hope that everyone here that was joined, I think we had up to almost 160 participants today. And really hope that everyone was able to not only sit and listen to this wonderful scholarship, but also be challenged. Really want to thank you again for taking the time out, Syl, for presenting the third annual Tom Regan lecture.